Thomas Sowell, economist. Point A. In 1948, as a young man who had dropped out of high school, you tried out for the Brooklyn Dodgers.
Oh my, you're bringing on, we have...
I want you to know, Tom, nothing you have done since elicits greater admiration on my part. You tried out for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Point B. In 1958, you graduated from Harvard. How did you get from A to B?
I flunked the tryout with the Dodgers.
Inequality. Quote, once we put production at the center of our attention, our surprise at extremes of income and wealth, rich people, rich countries, poor countries, our surprise at extremes of income and wealth might suggest the question whether there are comparable extremes in the production of wealth and whether these two extremes may have something to do with each other. Setting the possession of wealth aside to focus on the production of wealth. And that is intellectually more fruitful if you really want to know why some people are poor and some people are rich. That's
Absolutely. One of the painful things, see, I came from an earlier era when we were taught, you know, that the reason we have electric lights is because of Thomas Edison. The reason people can now afford cars, whereas 100 years ago, 1% of the American families had a car, is because Henry Ford figured out how to make cars a lot cheaper. You know, and various other things, we understood that. You never hear that these days. All you hear is that somebody is rich somehow, that for some reason, like it dropped out of the sky or something. And it's true, Bill Gates has more money than I guess some countries. But of course, he created more than some countries. But at the very least, you can ask the question. And you can find out maybe that wasn't true of others, maybe it wasn't true, yeah. But the fact is that question is kept off the table in most discussions now. They act as if somehow this guy has all this money, and as if it's almost as if you're implicitly assuming a fixed amount of wealth in the world. And if he has more, somebody else must have less.
Tell us what you mean by cultural prerequisites.
Partly, that would be simply the knowledge of how to use things. As I mentioned in the book, the main difference between us and the caveman is simply human capital. Don't forget the caveman had all the natural resources we have today, and he had them in greater abundance because none of them had ever been used up. But he didn't have the knowledge that it would take to turn those to his own purposes.
We just know more.
Yeah.
We just know more. Now, you note a certain productive capacity that certain cultural groups demonstrate. And you can see them because they demonstrate the same, let's call it industriousness, as they disperse to different parts of the world.
Yes.
Germans, Chinese, Lebanese, Jews, Indians, quote, the productivity is a matter of culture. That productivity as a matter of culture is shown by how many groups have arrived in various countries far poorer than the existing population and have nevertheless risen above the economic level of those who were there before them, close quote. Let's just choose the Jews.
Oh my heavens, that's been in so many places. My gosh, the Lower East Side of New York, one of the most terrible places when the Jews landed. The poverty and squalor is just unbelievable. In fact, even as late as the late 1940s, when I went to school on the Lower East Side, I had always heard that all Jews were rich. And when I saw the Lower East Side, I was like, why are these rich people living like this? The buildings on the Lower East Side were older and in worse conditions than the buildings in Harlem where I lived.
And they don't live there anymore?
No.
Those neighborhoods have turned over?
Yes. And it went by generation. The generation that was there first, even when they rose up to where they could have moved, they didn't, because many of them were not fluent in English and so on. And so you could live on the Lower East Side knowing only Yiddish. Right. And find doctors, lawyers, anything you wanted, go into stores and so forth. And if you moved up to upscale places like Harlem, which was once Jewish, or to the Bronx, which at another time which became Jewish, you would lose that. The more acculturated people, the next generation who spoke English and were more familiar with American society, they lived in those kinds of places.
Once again, wealth, poverty, and politics. Quote, the welfare state, which, by the way, is the recourse of virtually everybody who's concerned about inequality. Let's redistribute from the rich to the poor. Fine. So we expand the welfare state. And you argue, quote, the welfare state reduces the incentives to develop human capital, and receiving the products of other people's human capital, that is getting money from the rich if you're poor, is by no means as fundamental as developing one's own human capital, close quote. What is human capital, and why does the welfare state suppress the incentives to develop it?
Well, human capital is the ability to create the material things that constitute wealth. People have been puzzled by the fact for a long time that after a major war with huge destruction, once peace is restored, the economy gets restored often in a very few years. I think Western Europe after World War II, everything that was there was bombed, and they wondered why. How can that be? And John Stuart Mill explained this back in the middle of the 19th century, that the material things are going to be used up and wear out, whether there's a war or not. And so it's really the ability to reproduce, to operate those things, to maintain them, and then reproduce them was necessary. That's the real wealth. And so when you destroy the physical wealth, you really haven't done as much as if you destroyed the human capital. A classic example, in the 1970s, Uganda decided that the Gujaratis from India were just too wealthy and controlled too much of the economy. And they sent them out, and they wouldn't let them take their wealth with them. And so the Gujaratis arrived, mostly in England, destitute. And the Ugandan government has taken over all this material stuff. Over a period of a relatively few years, the Gujaratis were prosperous in England, and the Ugandan economy collapsed because they didn't have people who could do what the Gujaratis were doing, and so they no longer had the same production. It's also one of the problems with trying to finance things by confiscating the wealth of the wealthy. All you can confiscate is the material wealth. You cannot confiscate the human capital.
So the true wealth, the enduring wealth, the wealth that leads to wealth in the material world is between people's ears.
Absolutely.
And why does the welfare state suppress incentives for poor people to develop their human capital?
Of course, you can live off what other people have produced. And it's not just the welfare state. It's true among nations. Spain, for example, during its heyday in the 16th, 17th century, it received gold and silver literally by the ton, something like 200 tons of gold. If you can imagine, gold is normally measured in ounces. And so Spain didn't have to develop its human capital, and it didn't. It bought whatever it wanted because it had all of this. But when all of that money was spent and the colonies broke free and so on, Spain had nothing. And so Spain is today one of the poorest countries in Western Europe.
And that's just what the Saudis are afraid of right now.
And that's happening in Saudi Arabia. It's already happening in Saudi Arabia. Here, nature has given out to Saudi Arabia all this wealth. Great. The elite don't have to work. They live in have fabulous wealth. The ordinary Saudi doesn't have to do very much because the government subsidizes his housing, it subsidizes all kinds of things. And so over half the people in Saudi Arabia are foreigners who are in the Saudi workforce. And so they don't have to develop any human capital. If you go back some centuries earlier, when the Middle East was really one of the most advanced parts of the world, they hadn't yet discovered uses for petroleum. And so they had to work for everything, and they worked for it, and
that was the period where we get the great scholarship.
That's right. That's right.
Because they're okay. All right.